I'm recording my homily for the fourth Sunday of Easter in 2019. And this Sunday traditionally is a Sunday in which we call Good Shepherd Sunday. So all the readings, all the prayers during the Mass focus on Jesus Christ as our Good Shepherd, right? And then also this Sunday was Mother's Day. And so I actually want to take the two and bring them together and sing in a couple examples about mothers as good shepherds, as shepherds in our family, right? You think about the primary role of a mom is to shepherd, right? To shepherd her kids. So I'm going to go into those. Oftentimes when we think of like Good Shepherd Sunday, we think of the Pope and the bishops and the priests as our shepherds, right? And that's good. We often think about vocations to the priesthood and religious life, and that's great. We need to do that. But this Sunday, I talked a lot more about moms and dads. Moms and dads just being good shepherds and developing that ability to be good shepherds. A couple days before the Sunday, so last week, we had a Mass down in Tacoma at the Tacoma, or the Northwest Detention Center, which is an immigration detention center. And so we had a Mass there with Bishop Eusebio, and while we were driving down, I had a couple parishioners with me, and some they're moms, and so I was telling them, I was saying, now there's an expression that Pope Francis used, and I've thought a lot about it. I've tried to really ponder it, what it means to me in my life as a priest. But what I want to hear is what it means to you all as moms when you hear it. So the expression that Pope Francis used is that a good shepherd should smell like his sheep, right? A good shepherd should smell like his sheep. So what would that mean literally? It means a shepherd who's taking care of his sheep. He's close to them. He's not afraid to get down on the ground and help one of them if they're injured or they need to be protected. He's right there with them. So in other words, he's so close to them that he smells like them, okay? Fair enough. So as a priest, I think about what that means for me, but as moms, I say, what does that mean for you, right? And so some of these moms, they gave some good examples of, what it means. But then as the conversation kind of went on, I asked them, what are some obstacles for moms today to be good shepherds, to be good moms, right? For their kids and for others and their husband and all those things. And very quickly, one of the moms said, time. Time is an obstacle because if, working two jobs, your husband's working full time, you just don't have time with your kids. Now, one of the things to keep in mind, and I think this is absolutely right, because you notice that when you're with someone a lot, right? You're with someone, you're around them, you begin to just know them really deeply. When you see husbands and wives are really close to each other, they complete each other's sentences, right? They know each other's minds so well that they can complete each other's thoughts. But they wouldn't be able to do that if they weren't around each other all the time, if they weren't together. And so time to be with the kids, to know. And so, like, for example, when your teenager there's something not quite right? They're behaving just a little bit differently. If you're around them, you notice those things. You notice it's like, that's not normal. The behavior, there's something not right there. But if somebody's working full time, if somebody's not around their kids, and when they're home, they're just so frantic to get the chores done and get to bed and do all those things, just not going to notice those things. And so in that sense, the shepherd's not going to smell like the sheep. Now, I do think that's a legitimate concern in our culture that all of us have to check ourselves and say, have I become too busy with my obligations that I'm not being a shepherd to whoever's entrusted to me, right? So I think that's a really, really good point. I think it's a great phrase, though, also just to ponder and keep in mind and say, do I smell like my sheep? Now, what that doesn't mean is, am I just one of my sheep? Have I become so close that I'm no longer a shepherd, but I'm just one of the sheep? And that's not what the point of this is. It's to be close, but as a shepherd, right? To be the shepherd that knows their sheep. So Jesus says, my sheep know me, and they hear my voice, and they follow me. They know my voice. One of the other moms was sharing a little story about how just when the sheep hear their shepherd's voice, they're going to follow. But if they hear someone trying to imitate the voice, they're just going to keep eating. Just going to keep eating, right? Now, what if there's no shepherd? What if the sheep don't know who their shepherd is? They're just going to keep eating. But the problem with that is if there's no one to kind of bring them together, give them purpose, give them a mission, protect them, then they're eventually just going to wander off, right? And again, I think that's very pertinent for our world today. When we look at how many of our Catholics just wander off. So I talk to many of them, I know you talk to any priest and many of them are going to say, you know what, when I talked to somebody who left the church, most cases, it wasn't like a rational decision to say, I reject the Catholic Church. No, just kind of wandered off. Because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And so the shepherd then brings them together. So the shepherd is close to his sheep. He knows his sheep, and his sheep know his voice. When we were at the seminary, and I think I've shared this with you before, when we were at the seminary in Mount Angel, on the hilltop there, much of the vegetation was becoming overgrown, blackberries and all kinds of stuff, and it became a fire hazard. And so they decided to bring in a couple hundred sheep. And at first, not knowing sheep, I was like, they're not going to eat those blackberry vines. They're going to get, poked in the tongue and stuff like that. Well, it took them a while, but after a year, those blackberries were gone. I mean, over the entire hilltop, they ate everything down to the ground. It was amazing, right? Okay, that was beside the point. That's for another homily. But the shepherd, this woman who had come every once in a while to move the sheep, right, to move them around. And sometimes when I would watch, all she would do is she would just start calling out to them, and then she would just start walking, and the sheep would follow her. Now, that's one version of leading, and that version of leading as a shepherd implies that everything's going well in your life. You're doing great. You're doing a great job. And so your sheep want to follow you. So it implies all the work that goes into creating this bond, and then it works right. You just call your sheep, and they follow you. It's beautiful when you see that, right? When you see kids doing well, and they're following the example of their parents, they love their faith, and it's beautiful to see that. But this shepherd would also have a dog, and the dog would go to the back, and the dog would run around in the back, kind of pushing him along and not necessarily nipping at him, but, barking and reminding the sheep who are a little more inclined to go astray to come back, right? To get back in and to follow and to focus, right? To focus for the sheep who perhaps are struggling with their attention focusing, okay? And so, because we live in a world that's not perfect, I think there's truth to that too, right? That sometimes we lead from the front because everything's going well. Sometimes we have to come around in the back and we have to kind of be more directive. And that doesn't mean being mean or that means that, it's just tough love, but it's a different mode of being a shepherd. And if the shepherd doesn't do that, they're going to lose a whole lot of sheep, right? And so coming back around and saying, okay, I have to encourage, I have to kind of round them up a little more deliberately. Okay, so we live in a world that's not necessarily perfect. After one of the morning masses, one of my parishioners came up and he said, look, even Jesus lost one of them, right? And Jesus is the perfect shepherd. And even one of the 12, Judas, he lost him. And when Jesus was here, he struggled with the other sheep, right? The other 12. Now in my office, somebody many years ago, somebody gave me a picture of the Good Shepherd. And it's a painting. And so you have Jesus, and you have about 12 sheep around him, and one of them right behind him is black, right? So the black sheep. And the black sheep seems to be intentionally staying in his blind spot, staying out of his sight, trying to stay back there, right? Whereas the other sheep are just kind of standing around Jesus eating. But then what's cool is that in the background, there's more sheep. There's like another little herd there. And so the idea that in the world that we live in, there are some people who never had a good mom. They never had maybe even a mom. Or maybe they never even had a dad. Or maybe their relationship with their dad was almost non-existent. Maybe their dad was emotionally distant. Whatever it was, maybe dad was just too busy. There was a sheep over there who needed a shepherd. And so the Holy Spirit in our lives is constantly working in our hearts for ways to make connections for people who have been neglected, who was supposed to be their shepherd but was not their shepherd, failed in that duty. And so God looks for ways to try to compensate for that. And so for us, our sheep is not just our immediate family, or maybe even just our extended family, but it's also strangers. So we look at how we treat strangers. We look at how we treat our neighbors, right? In the United States, it's really sad because we've lost a sense of community. Okay, how to be a good shepherd in whatever environment that we find ourselves in. Maybe also at work, how to be a good shepherd in the workplace. Okay, living in an imperfect world, we recognize there's a lot of people who didn't have that shepherding. And so for us to be mindful of that, okay? There's a ministry that I really want to start, and I keep putting it off because there's other things we're working on, but I want to call it Souls, S-O-L-S, okay? Souls, shepherds of lost sheep. And basically the idea is that we would have people who would go out in the community here and just walking up and down State Street. State Street's our main street here. Just walking up and down the street, watching for some of our homeless people. And most of the homeless people in our area, they're young. They're in their 20s and 30s and 40s. They're young and they're generally struggling with drugs. Okay? Sometimes we have homeless people who are, it doesn't involve drugs. Sometimes we have homeless people who have some pretty serious mental issues. But a lot of it's drugs. And so just kind of going out, and the purpose is just to get to know them. Just to get to know them, spend time with them. And maybe we, again, we try to do this in a safe way. We're not going to go into the bushes. We're not going to follow them. We're not going to do anything like that. But just as they come out and as they come around, we would have people who would just try on a regular basis to engage them and get to know them so that we can try to get to know all the homeless people in our area. And I know they're very transitory, but the idea being is that they are also part of God's flock. Right? In fact, every single human person, every person that has come into existence, Jesus Christ desires to make part of his flock. So, okay, that was a side note. A couple examples. So, one example that comes to mind for me of someone who embodies the nature of being a good shepherd in a world that's not perfect. Saint Monica. Saint Monica was the mother of Saint Augustine, but Saint Augustine wasn't always a saint. I believe she had two sons, right? And they both had their issues. But there's this time period where Saint Monica simply will not give up on them. Constantly praying for them, refuses to give up on them. Now, Augustine makes all kinds of mistakes. He becomes totally the black sheep. I can relate to that in my family. You know, in my family, we were chronologically black sheep. It's like we would take turns. There were between me and my brothers and sisters, we would pass the baton on to each other. And we would have a bad year, and so we'd be the black sheep, and then we'd pass it on to our sibling. But we all had this moment where we were not making very good decisions, kind of rebelling. St. Augustine made some really, really bad decisions. And St. Monica, his mother, she never gave up on him. Never gave up on him. And so one of the most important things I believe about being a good shepherd is perseverance. Sometimes we measure our abilities as shepherds by outcome, by were we successful? Did our kids turn out successful? Did they turn out right? What kind of grades are they getting? All these things, what kind of groups are they leading or being a part of? It's very dangerous because none of those things really in God's eyes are a measure of success. Because a person can be very academically, a very high achiever academically, making lots of money, and completely abandon God in their life, right? Completely be a jerk. So those things are not, those forms of success are not necessarily forms or measures of success as shepherds. And so as parents, when one of our kids goes astray, when one of our kids leaves the faith, you see them begin to question themselves and say, I must have done something wrong. Now, it is possible. Sometimes we do things that are wrong. We're not perfect. However, do not allow that to become a measure of your abilities as a shepherd. Persevere. Don't give up on them. Jesus will allow some of our sheep to go astray, will allow them to use their free will, to be the prodigal son, right? To walk away. In some ways to see, will we be a good shepherd? Will we not give up on them? No matter what, will we not give up on them? Will we persevere? Right? St. Monica persevered. Now eventually her son came back and became a bishop, became one of the greatest theologians in the Catholic Church. When there's this moment when he's coming back to the faith, and St. Monica realizes that that's why she was here. That's why God wanted her to be here on earth, was to help bring her son back. And as soon as he came back, she realized that her job was done. The other example I want to use is not a Catholic example per se. So I'm just finishing a book on Abraham Lincoln. I've told you about this book before. It's called Team of Rivals. But at the very end of the book, so just a little bit of synopsis about Abraham Lincoln. So when he was elected president, the southern states in the United States immediately separated themselves from the United States. They took his election, in a sense, as an act of war against the southern states, because they knew that his platform, his view on things, was that the country could not endure if slavery were to endure. Now, he wasn't necessarily pushing that the South had to get rid of slavery, but he was pushing that all the new states and the rest of the country would never ever become slave states. And so he viewed slavery as hostile to the life of our country. So the South separates the second Abraham Lincoln's elected president. And so the Civil War rages basically through his entire presidency. Now, can you imagine if you were appointed boss of a company, to be the CEO, and immediately half of your employees quit because you're the boss? Imagine how hard that would be, right? When you read about Abraham Lincoln, he was a man of such incredible patience. And he never gave up on the South. He could have wrote him off as the North began to win the war. He could have punished the South. He could have basically obliterated the South. He had all the power to do it. In fact, most of the politicians wanted to drastically punish the South as they began to win the war. And Abraham Lincoln refused to do it. He said, no, we need to bring them back. We need to bring them back in. They were like the lost sheep. He wanted to bring them back in. Which makes the end of the story all the more tragic. 5 days after they had won the war, someone from the South came up and assassinated Abraham Lincoln just for spite. Just for spite. The war was done, the North had won, the South had lost, and Abraham Lincoln in reality, and the people in the South knew this, he really was their number one advocate to protect them from revenge. And they just kill him. Now, who does that sound like in some ways? Jesus, as the Good Shepherd, in the end, had to give everything. He had to give everything. He had to give his life completely to his flock. And so in that sense, he has such an incredible embodiment. Jesus Christ has this incredible embodiment of what it means to smell like the sheep, or I should say, for the sheep to smell like the shepherd. Right? So lastly, the week before, you have this conversation between Peter and Jesus. And Jesus asks Peter 3 times, Peter, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Right? And so he's getting at this idea of persevering because we live in a world that's not perfect. Peter knows that firsthand. He's made mistakes, right? But he wants to see, Peter, will you persevere in this? Will you be a good shepherd to the end? And as Peter answers those questions, and as he demonstrates that he's building that strength to persevere, Jesus responds to him by saying, feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. And his instruction is the same for us with our lambs and our sheep. All right. God bless you. I'll see you next week.